The wind howled down the empty main street, driving a veil of dust through the lifeless town. A single figure lay sprawled in the dirt, his coat pulled by the breeze, the tin star on his chest catching the last glow of the setting sun. It was the only thing that still gleamed in this forsaken place. Somewhere in the distance, a shutter slammed in the wind. No one came to help. No one even dared to step outside. In the fading light, questions hung heavier than the evening air. Had he been gunned down in a quick-draw duel with a ruthless outlaw? Or was the shot fired by a hand he once trusted? Tonight, we follow the trail backward into the dust and the blood to uncover the truth behind the last days of the most legendary sheriffs the Wild West ever knew. Forget the dime novels, the painted theater shows, and the romantic portraits that hang in saloons. The truth is far grittier. The sheriffs of the American frontier lived with one boot in the grave from the day they pinned on the badge. The late 1800s were no playground for heroes. Law was fragile, more a suggestion than a guarantee. Towns sprouted from the wilderness, overnight rough-hewn shacks, a few stubborn families, and a saloon that opened before the church. These towns attracted drifters and dreamers, and predators. Gunfights could erupt over a crooked card game, a stolen horse, or a careless insult. Sheriffs were expected to keep the peace, but their jurisdiction was vast, their deputies few, and their enemies many. Political rivalries simmered in the back rooms of saloons. Racial tensions boiled over in the dusty streets. A badge did not grant immunity, it painted a target. Hollywood would have you believe sheriffs strode fearlessly into danger, their coats billowing and their revolvers steady. The reality was colder, lonelier. They were men who carried the weight of the law in places where justice often came down to the speed of a trigger finger. And yet, among them were names that carved themselves into legend. Bass Reeves rode taller than most, not in stature, but in presence. Born into slavery, he escaped during the Civil War and fled into Indian Territory, where he learned the languages and tracking skills of the native tribes. By the time he became a deputy U.S. Marshal, Reeves was the embodiment of justice on horseback. His eyes could read the ground like an open book, finding the trail of a fugitive where others saw only dirt and scrub. He carried himself with a quiet authority, the kind of man who didn't need to shout to command a room. His reputation spread like prairie fire. Outlaws knew that if Bass Reeves was on your trail, it was only a matter of time before you felt the cold ring of iron on your wrists. One tale told of Reeves riding alone into a camp of 5 armed killers. By dawn, he was riding out every one of them shackled behind him. Then there was Tom Blackjack Ketchum. His name was as likely to stir fear as respect. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a stare that could pin a man in place. Ketchum was a sheriff who didn't play by the rule book, mostly because the rule book didn't exist out here. He could talk a man down with a calm word, or knock him senseless with the butt of his Colt. Ketchum knew. The West was a place where the line between lawman and outlaw was blurred. Rumors clung to him like dust, that he'd run with bandits in his youth, that he'd taken bribes, that he'd settled more scores than the law allowed. Yet, when trouble came to town, it was Ketchum the people looked to, and more often than not, he delivered. And then there was Wild Bill Hickok, part sheriff, part gambler, part legend. His hair flowed to his shoulders, and his pistols rode low on his hips. Hickok had the look of a man carved from the very bones of the West. But behind those steel-gray eyes was a man who carried ghosts. He had killed more men than he cared to count, some in duels, others in dark alleys, when the other fellow didn't give him the chance to draw. Hickok was as quick with a smile as with his gun, but those who knew him understood that every laugh came with an undertow of sorrow. Cards were his comfort, the clink of chips and the shuffle of a deck masking the ticking clock of enemies he'd made along the way. These men lived different lives, rode different trails, but the wind of fate was driving them toward the same end, and it was closer than they knew. In the winter of 1901, a storm rolled over Indian Territory like a dark tide. Bass Reeves rode into it, chasing a fugitive wanted for murder. Snow came thick and fast, blinding him, freezing his hands to the reins. Somewhere ahead was a killer who knew the land and was just as desperate to live as Reeves was to catch him. The cold bit deep, but Reeves pressed on, the faint trail a whisper in the snow, far south. Tom Ketchum was walking into his own trap. A bitter election had left the town split down the middle, and Ketchum was caught in the crossfire of politics. The losing side had power in numbers, and some of them were wearing badges of their own. Ketchum could feel the ground shifting under his boots, could see the sidelong glances in the saloon. Men he'd once called friends now measured him with the eyes of strangers. There were whispers of a meeting, men gathering in secret to discuss a change in leadership. In the West, that kind of talk often ended in blood. In Deadwood, Wild Bill Hickok sat in the number 10 saloon, cards in hand. He'd taken the seat against the wall, as was his habit, but tonight the chair was occupied when he arrived. Forced to sit with his back to the door, Hickok's eyes kept flicking toward the entrance. He could feel it, the prickling awareness of being hunted. In the laughter of the crowd, in the rattle of poker chips, in the creak of the swinging doors. The sound of his own death seemed to whisper just out of earshot. These men had stared down death before, but this time the game had changed. Their enemies were closer, their luck thinner, and the West itself was changing. The railroad had come, barbed wire was stretching across open range, and the days of the lone sheriff holding back the darkness were fading. For Reeves, for Ketchum, for Hickok, the question was no longer if death would find them, but when. And on these hard wind-bitten streets, that answer was already riding toward them. Snow fell so thick it erased the world. Bass Reeves leaned forward in the saddle, eyes narrowed against the biting wind. The trail he had been following all morning was vanishing under a fresh white blanket, the faint hoofprints smudging into nothingness. His breath came in harsh clouds, freezing on his beard. The cold had crawled into his bones, stiffening his fingers until they could barely grip the reins. Somewhere out here, somewhere close, was the man he'd been sent to bring back alive. Reeves knew the killer was using the storm as cover, doubling back perhaps, waiting for the moment the marshal would falter. The snow was both an enemy and a shroud. Hypothermia whispered in his ears, telling him to rest, to close his eyes. But Reeves pressed on, refusing to give the cold that victory. Far south, under a sun that baked the land into cracked clay, Tom Ketchum spurred his horse into the Badlands. His quarry, a horse thief with a knack for disappearing, had been spotted 2 days prior, near a canyon, choked with rattlesnakes. Ketchum's horse moved cautiously, hooves crunching over loose stones, the air filled with the dry buzz of danger. Every step risked a strike from the shadows beneath the rocks. Sweat stung his eyes, but he kept them scanning, not just for snakes but for the man he hunted. It wasn't the first time he'd been in a place where nature itself wanted him dead, but here, with the cliffs hemming him in, it felt like the land was conspiring with the outlaw. And in Deadwood, the haze of tobacco and whiskey clung thick in the number 10 saloon. Wild Bill Hickok leaned back in his chair, the brim of his hat casting his eyes in shadow. He shuffled his cards slowly, almost too slowly, listening more than watching. Every creak of the floorboards behind him set his jaw tighter. Every burst of laughter from the far table made his hand twitch toward his pistol. The game was going poorly, but worse than the cards was the feeling that someone was waiting for him to relax, to lean forward, to forget for just a moment that his back was exposed. The saloon was a cage of noise and smoke, and somewhere in it, death was breathing down his neck. The dangers of the land were matched only by the dangers of men. In the frozen wilderness, Reeves finally found a break in the storm's white curtain, a flicker of movement ahead. Too late, he realized the trail had been bait. 3 men rose from the snowbanks, rifles glinting dully in the gray light. Reeves dismounted slowly, his hands away from his revolver. "You boys cold," he called, his voice carrying over the wind. They smirked, fanning out. Reeves counted their steps, measured their angles. Then he lunged sideways, using his horse as cover. As his colt barked twice, one man fell. The others returned fire, but Reeves was already moving, ghosting from drift to drift until he was gone from their sight. Circling behind like the predator he was, Ketchum's danger came not from the outlaw he hunted, but from the lawmen he rode with. As they reached a rocky outcrop, two deputies hung back, their horses stamping nervously. "You've been sheriff too long, Tom," one said, voice casual but eyes sharp. "Town's changing, needs a different kind of man in charge." Ketchum's hand stayed near his pistol. He read the shift in their stances, the way their thumbs brushed over their hammers. "Maybe," he said evenly, "but today ain't that day." Silence stretched between them, thick as the desert heat. In the end, the deputies stepped back, their plans delayed, but not forgotten. Ketchum rode on, feeling the weight of their stares burning between his shoulder blades. In Deadwood, Hickok's paranoia was sharpening into certainty. A new player had joined the table, a young man with eyes that never smiled. He played clumsy, losing chips steadily, but never looking frustrated. Instead, his gaze kept darting to Hickok's chest, then to his back, as if measuring distance. Hickok kept his voice easy, but inside, every instinct screamed. The cards in his hand meant nothing. The real game was happening above the table, in the glances and the shifting of boots. He didn't know who would make the first move, only that it would come, and while the worlds pressed in from every side, the greater battle was within. Reeves felt the cold's teeth digging deeper, and with it came memories he couldn't stop. The face of the man who had owned him, the years of silence and servitude, the promise he'd made when he fled. "I will never bow again." Every arrest, every bullet dodged, every winter storm endured was his proof that he had kept that vow. But the cold whispered that even the strongest promises could break. Ketchum, pushing through the canyon, wondered if he'd been a fool all these years. How many men had he buried? How many families had cursed his name? He had kept order, yes, but was it the kind that lasted, or just the kind that left more graves in the ground? The men plotting against him weren't just enemies, they were the next chapter in the story, and maybe the town would turn the page without him. Hickok heard his mother's voice in the back of his mind, as clear as if she were standing in the saloon beside him. Fast hands draw faster enemies. Well, he had lived his life by the draw, but every second now felt like the click of a clock running out. He had been too fast, too many times, and now the enemies left were the ones willing to wait for his back to turn. And then, as if the West itself had decided to intervene, came the strangers. Reeves, staggering through the snow, collapsed against a drift. The world was narrowing to a pinhole when a shadow loomed above him. A hand reached down, rough, weathered, silent. A Native American hunter, his face unreadable, lifted Reeves to his feet and half-dragged, half-guided him toward the thin glow of a fire. No words passed between them. None were needed. Ketchum's reprieve came in the sharp crack of a rifle. One of the deputies who had shadowed him cried out and fell from his saddle. Ketchum spun, scanning the ridges, but saw only a wisp of gun smoke curling away on the breeze. Whoever had fired had vanished as swiftly as they'd come, leaving Ketchum alive and with more questions than answers. In Deadwood, the stranger's warning came not in a bullet, but a whisper. As Hickok leaned back from the table, a voice brushed his ear. "Don't face the door tonight." He turned, but the speaker was already gone, swallowed by the crowd. Hickok's hand tightened on his cards. The game was still on, but the stakes had just changed. The storm had not eased, but Bass Reeves rode into it as if it were nothing more than dust. His mysterious companion moved beside him without a word, his face hidden beneath a fur-lined hood, rifle slung over one shoulder. They had tracked the killers to a ridge, where the snow broke against jagged rocks, a place Reeves knew well in bush country. He dismounted first, sinking into the drifts, and signaled his ally to circle wide. In the silence between gusts, the faint murmur of voices drifted down from the ridge. Reeves' breath slowed. This was it. They would not ride away today. In the canyonlands to the south, Tom Ketchum moved like a shadow. The men who wanted him dead thought they were hunting him, but he had been 2 steps ahead all along. He had spent the morning planting his own kind of traps, loose rocks where a man might stumble, a coil of rope ready to yank a rifle out of an enemy's hands. Now he waited in a narrow pass, where the wind whispered through the rocks and every sound carried. His Colt was loaded, his knife tucked into his boot. There would be no mistakes. And in Deadwood, Wild Bill Hickok's chair creaked as he leaned forward, eyes fixed on the cards in his hand. Black aces, black eights. He could feel the shape of fate pressing in on him. Every time the saloon door swung open, his skin prickled. Every time someone shifted behind him, his hand drifted toward his holster. The room was warm with lamplight and liquor, but Hickok sat in a cold bubble of awareness. Somewhere in the noise and laughter, death was biding its time. The first shot in the hills came from Reeves' rifle. One outlaw dropped into the snow before the others even knew they were under attack. His ally moved like a wraith among the rocks, each shot deliberate, each hit clean. The killers scattered, firing wildly, into the blizzard. Reeves advanced, his boots crunching over ice. Then he saw one of them rise from behind a drift, rifle aimed at his companion's back. Reeves shouted a warning, swallowed by the wind, and stepped into the open. His Colt roared. The outlaw fell, but a second shot cracked through the storm. Reeves staggered, blood blooming bright against the snow. Still he stayed on his feet, buying his friend the seconds needed to finish the fight. Only when the last outlaw lay still did Reeves fall, his breath clouding once before fading entirely. In the canyon, Ketchum's trap sprang to life. The first deputy rounded the bend and caught the coil of rope across his chest, tumbling from his saddle. The second fired, the shot ricocheting off stone as Ketchum's Colt answered. Dust choked the air, and in the chaos Ketchum heard boots crunching close to close. He turned, and there stood a man he had once called brother. The look in his eyes was colder than the steel in his hand. "Sorry, Tom," the man said, and fired. Ketchum stumbled back, his badge catching the afternoon sun as he fell. He touched it once, as though making sure it was still there, then went still with it, shining on his chest. In Deadwood, the air shifted behind Hickok, a single footstep in the wrong rhythm. His fingers closed on his cards, the black aces and eights staring back at him. He began to turn, but the thunder came first. A pistol barked once, the sound muffled by the shouts and laughter. The impact drove him forward, the cards tumbling from his hand, scattering like dead leaves on the floorboards. Gasps rippled through the room as Hickok slumped sideways, his hat rolling from his head. The man who had killed him stepped back into the crowd, his work done before most even realized a legend had just fallen. The funerals came quietly, without fanfare. Reeves was laid to rest beneath a simple marker, his name carved deep into the wood by the hand of the man he had saved. Ketchum's coffin was lowered into the dry earth outside town, the wind scattering dust across the mourner's boots. Hick's grave in Deadwood became a place of pilgrimage. Gamblers and gunslingers alike leaving cards and coins on the mound. Whispers grew in the saloons and along the trails. Reeves had been the law in a land that respected none. Ketchum had stood his ground until the ground gave way beneath him. Hickok had played his last hand with his back to the door. Their stories became part of the West itself, stitched into the fabric of every campfire tale. But for those who knew them, the truth was simpler. They were men who had carried the weight of justice until it broke them. 3 badges lay in the dust now, their shine dulled, their owners gone. The wind picked them up, spun them once, and set them down again. If their courage and sacrifice moved you, don't let their names fade into the dust. Share this story. Keep their legends alive. Like, comment, and subscribe, because some stories deserve to be told for as long as the West still whispers.